It's the Blue Vote Cafe, a little bit wonkish, a whole lot of fun. I'm David Schellenberg with Rachel Oyster in Canada's capital of Ottawa. Hello, Rachel.
Hello, David.
It is fall in Ottawa. The leaves are changing. We've just finished Thanksgiving, the Canadian Thanksgiving.
Yeah, that's right. Canadian Thanksgiving was just behind us. And yes, the autumnal weather rolled in just in time for it.
Yeah, exactly. Who's with us today?
Today, our guest is Ashley Houghton, who is the Senior Director of Programs and Policy with FairVote. And we're delighted to welcome you to the cafe, Ashley. Hello.
Oh, I am so happy to be here. I have my tea. I'm thrilled to be joining you.
Oh, what kind of tea?
Oh, it's a raspberry tea. I decided not to.
I had raspberry with hibiscus this morning.
Oh.
I'm betting David's just a black tea kind of guy. Plain old orange pico, right?
What a lovely conversation about tea.
I cannot relate. I have a deep dark tea. I love my light red.
I like variety in tea.
So, Ashley, what part of the world are you in?
I am in Silver Spring, just outside our nation's capital, Washington, D.C.
Oh, cool. Not far from my birthplace of Kensington.
I remember you mentioning that. I believe, yes, I am actually from Rockville, Maryland, famous for the song Don't Go Back to Rockville, which I've done multiple times, but always grew up outside of our nation's capital and one day always aspired to become part of that advocacy machine.
Right. Oh, how wonderful. Yeah, so tell us everything. We want to know about FairVote, and we want to know how you got involved in what you're doing. So why don't you start by telling us what FairVote is, how it got started, who started it, and why?
Sure. So FairVote was started in 1992 by our co-founder, Rob Ritchie. And there were, certainly a swath of others that were heavily involved, including presidential candidate John Anderson. I don't remember. Mm-hmm. Remember the third-party candidate who was running at the time. But it started as a research and advocacy organization. And I think you could safely look back and say that for a large part of our history, FairVote was really trying to research which election reforms would lead to a better democracy for all Americans. And then we started market testing them and saying, like, which ones would people actually be interested in? Which ones would they get behind? And we identified a couple as having real strength. And so I would say for the last decade plus of FairVote's work, we've been researching ranked choice voting and the proportional form of ranked choice voting, and then also advocating for those reforms across the country.
Right, right. And so this is... It's the system where if there's 5 candidates running, you number them in your favorite from number 1 to number 5.
That's right.
Yeah.
And although then, you can always just rank 1 if you prefer. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. You don't have to pick them all. Yeah. And then what happens?
And then let's say there are a whole bunch of candidates that are running for one spot. If your favorite candidate will not show any sign of gaining traction and the support is kind of broad across the field, your second choice will count as your next choice until someone emerges with a majority of voters represented in the outcome.
So yeah, generally you count them all up, and then whoever's in last place, you take their votes and distribute them. Exactly. Yeah, to wherever. And you honestly believe this makes for better elections?
Oh, I can share. I've seen this in person. So I came across this as a convert, and that's often what you see from people who care deeply about ranked choice voting. I've worked on a number of other political issues, and I just found myself banging my head against the wall for decades, years. And I was I had voted in a local Oakland election. I didn't remember the experience, I will freely admit, at all. This was in 2016. And I was talking to my brother, who both of us are Australian on our mother's side, but he actually lives there now. And he said, yeah, Ashley, if you all just had ranked choice voting, this would all just be so much easier. You wouldn't have all of this spoiler effect. You wouldn't have all this strategic voting that you all are doing. People would actually be incentivized to try to win support instead of trying to get their opponents' supporters to stay home on election day. And I thought, Grant, what are you talking about? And then I looked it up and I realized that I'd already voted in a ranked choice voting election.
Oh,
my goodness. Well, this is so straightforward. Why don't we have this nationally? And so I discovered FairVote and quickly came on board and didn't realize how extraordinarily popular this reform would be. Like, I mean, look at the world right now. It is nearly impossible to do anything. Right? It is very difficult to feel like you're making an impact in the world. And ranked choice voting in particular has been the fastest growing nonpartisan election reform in the country. In that election that I voted in 2016, there were only 10 cities that had access to it nationwide. And now we have 49 cities and counties. We have 2 states that use it across the whole state. So it has been pretty extraordinary seeing this gain traction.
Yeah, in Canada, the political parties have used it to pick their leaders since the 90s, I'm pretty sure, with one of them. So it's been around for a while. It's not a new idea at all.
Yeah, it's not a new idea. And it's really, I think, one of the most straightforward ways to deal with some of the most fundamental challenges with our democracy right now. So I mentioned strategic voting. I think everyone's been in this scenario, right? You're sitting down, you have your list in front of you, and you find yourself trying to decide who is the lesser of two evils. It's like, oh, I really want this person, but I know that if I do that, I'm just going to throw my vote away. This removes that concept because you can safely rank someone first and know that if they aren't a viable candidate, it will always come in second. And then the other thing that it does is it creates this incentive structure through the campaigns process where if you're a candidate, your goal is to try to get as many people's second place support as possible if you can't be their favorite. And so instead of mudslinging, what it does is it contributes to this culture of more collaborative campaigning, of positive campaigning, trying to win other people's support. And it also lowers barriers to participate for women and for candidates of color. So like, who gets hurt by this spoiler effect, right? It is people who are told to wait their turn. And who is told to wait their turn? It tends to be women, it tends to be younger candidates, it tends to be candidates of color. And so ranked choice voting removes that, wait your turn dynamic.
Right. So the cities that are using it now, are they using it to pick the mayor or councillors, or what are they using it for?
Yeah, I mean, they can use it across the board. So we've seen it used in political primaries. So let's say you have a competitive primary field. 2020, good example of that. We had a very busy primary field on the Democrat side. This can help winnow that to a candidate that can really lean into that general election with a lot of consensus support. But it's also used, in Alaska and Maine, across the state, and in Maine and federal elections as well, all the way down to city councilors. I've seen PTA members elected with this.
Mm-hmm. Ranked choice voting isn't all one thing. So we should probably talk about the alternatives within that fairly broad category, actually. And I think FairVote has a particular advocacy in that regard.
Right. So there are many different election reform methods out there as there are fish in the ocean, right? So and I think that particularly when you get the kinds of people who care about elections as we see at FairVote, all of us tend to come to the table with an idea, right? But we tend to support the version of ranked choice voting called the instant runoff that's been used. So for us, what was most important was identifying the use case scenario where it had been tried and true in the real world and that we could see it implemented effectively. Now, the good news is because it is a reform that works with other election methods, you can see it used in a place that uses, say, like top 4, top 5 voting, where you have an open primary and then you use ranked choice voting to select from the top 4, top 5 candidates. But you can also see it, as I mentioned, in party-run primaries. You can see it in multi-winner elections where you have a whole bunch of candidates running for, say, 5 slots. You can still use it in that. So what I like to say is it also ends up becoming the mortar between the bricks of other elections that are out there.
But how are they different, these different methods? What changes?
Wait, yeah, let's get very specific about what instant runoff is.
Yeah, instant runoff is
as compared with the other possibilities.
Yeah.
But just to explain for people who might have not thought about ranked choice, they just know it as a thing, but they don't know what it means.
Sure. So and to be clear, before I joined FairVote, I didn't know what any of these reform methods were either, right? And since most of my time is spent on kind of the implementation of the one that we've found gain traction, I'm less of an expert, I would say, on some of these other reforms out there. But there are a lot of it ends up coming down to how votes are counted, right? So when you're ranking candidates, how do you decide what comes, when to eliminate, how surplus votes are transferred in some cases, that kind of thing. So in single winner ranked choice voting elections, as we noted, you eliminate the last place candidate. Your second choice gets counted until someone emerges with a majority of support. Right. Now, in something called a proportional form of ranked choice voting, let's say you're electing people to multiple seats. That's an opportunity where your goal is actually to lower the threshold, because what you're looking for is for as many voters to be represented in the final outcome as possible. And so what you often do is there's something called the proportional form of ranked choice voting, where you identify a surplus, and then the whoever gets as many tallies above a certain amount, you transfer a fraction of those to people's second choices and so forth. So it's not just eliminating the last place, it's also identifying what excess you have in that first place and transferring that over.
Okay. I think for listeners,
yeah.
we need to get...
So we're getting into it here.
Well, no. I mean, we just really need to explain very clearly what this is. So you as a voter get a ballot, and you have, I guess we should choose a specific number of candidates on that ballot, and you rank them by your order of preference. You
1 to
choose the
5.
first-
Yep.
Okay, so we're saying 5.
Yeah. I just pick a number.
First, second, third, fourth,
Yeah.
fifth choice. Okay, so you collect the ballots, and whoever gets the fewest number of votes of any of those first, second, third, fourth, fifth choices gets thrown out. That candidate's no longer in the mix, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And so you take the ballots from the people who ranked that person first, and you redistribute. You take all of their votes and you count those.
Whoever their number 2 choice is.
Whoever their number 2 choice is, you
Yeah.
count those votes as if they were their first choice
Right.
among the 4 remaining candidates. Right. So, right. And now, go ahead.
A single winner, let's say you have David, Rachel, and Ashley on the ballot. We'll make
It's very
Now we got
simple.
3 people.
Right? And you really like Rachel.
For obvious reasons.
For obvious. The charisma alone, much less the platform, right? And so you really like Rachel, but you could live with David, kind of like David too. But Ashley's the worst. You really just don't want Ashley. So on your ballot, you would pick Rachel first, and then David second, and you might leave me off entirely.
Right.
So you have your rank. Now, when we're counting those ballots, let's say Rachel, despite being charismatic and having an excellent platform, you just don't get that much support. It's not your day.
Right.
Anyone who selected you as their first place candidate, you would look at those. We would say Rachel is no longer in the running, and you would count up from the people who selected you first, what were their second choices? And so if more of them chose David over me, that means that David ends up winning the election.
Oh.
You didn't know you were going to come out ahead.
So let's put it in a different context, right? So let's say I am a really divisive character. It is very, I am coming out here and I am saying, don't vote for Rachel, don't vote for David, just vote for me. Stay at home. These people are the worst. I might not win your supporter's second choice. Right? So that's part of how that works as well. But let's take it in another context. So let's look at something like a presidential primary, right?
Yeah.
So something that happens a lot with Democrats abroad, you're often hopefully voting by mail, right? let's say you have a competitive primary, you have, say, 10 people who are running for this very important office. What happens if between the time that you select your favorite candidate on your ballot and you send it in, they drop out before Election Day, which has happened. So,
oh, yeah, absolutely.
So we saw in the 2020 cycle, 3 million people lost. Like, it was a wasted vote on the primary side because there were so many candidates who dropped out between early voting and Election Day. Mm-hmm. So ranked choice voting, you could have selected your second choice.
Right. So it gives you a little backup protection. Fair enough. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But coming back, go ahead.
Oh, yes, go ahead. No, go for it.
Oh, no, we strayed a little bit far from where you had been, where you were talking about surplus votes. The problem comes in, we're talking large numbers. We're not talking.
Sure. No, of course.
6 people choosing between the 3 of us.
Let's say, and what I'm talking about is the proportional form of ranked choice voting.
Right.
Your goal is to try to get a final group of elected officials who reflect the interests of the voting populace as much as possible. Like, how close can we get to that level of accuracy? Mm-hmm. And so let's say there are 3 slots that are available, 3 seats that are available, and you have 5 people running.
Right.
In that scenario, we have, and I can kind of get into math. I'll admit I was a communications major, government. I'm not great at the math part. But you would actually have a threshold that's lower than 50%. It would be 25%, because anything above 25, you know that someone's going to win one of those 3 slots. So in that case, let's say one candidate has an overwhelming amount of support. Nearly everyone likes this. Mm-hmm. What you want to do is be able to support that person for that one seat, but not lose the power of your vote because they're a popular candidate. So what we do with that is anyone who gets more than 25% support in that first round, you take that surplus, so whatever's above that 25%, and you just transfer a fraction of people's support to their second choices. So it's kind of like if you were going into a store and you know an ice cream costs 80 cents and you have $1 in your hand, you really want to get that 20 cents back because you know you can use it. You know, mm-hmm. it's a way to really squeeze as much power as possible out of your vote. And then what ends up happening is you have 3 winning candidates. You go back and you eliminate whoever's in last place until you have 3 candidates who are showing support, not just from the carryover of people who really liked the most popular candidate, but mm-hmm. also those who liked unpopular candidates. They get their votes redistributed as well.
And what's that version called?
It's called the proportional form of ranked choice voting. You've also, it's a very old method, but it's also one that has a number of different names depending on who you're talking to. So the single transferable vote, it can get real wonky real fast. Well,
I think that's one of the things you've sort of struggling with is how many, let's call them official common variations of ranked choice balloting are there?
Well, so there's the theory, and then there's the
practice,
and what's happening. So I would put them in 2 categories. It's where you have one winner, and then where you have multiple winners.
Okay,
and so
right.
When it comes to one winner, there's really one standard there. It's the instant runoff. When there are multiple winners, there are kind of variations on a theme when it comes to the proportional form.
So when I first started thinking about ranked choice voting, I didn't do any research at all into the different ways to do it.
Sure.
I'll tell you the specifics we were looking at renaming our local chapter of Democrats Abroad. The name for the chapter was at the time the National Capital Region, which didn't work in an international context because it could be the national capital of any country.
Everybody's got a national capital region.
Including the U.S. And we are in Canada. So it needed to say something about where in the world we were. And we came up with, I think actually it was 6 different possibilities. And it was my initiative to get the name changed. And I was running how it was done. And I invented a system, which I later learned is called order count, where I gave each ranking a weight. So if you ranked someone first, if you ranked one of the names in first place, then it got 6 points. If you ranked a name in second place, it got 5 points, which seemed to me the best way to reflect. I mean, this is a completely intuitively invented process, but it seemed the best way to reflect the fact that everyone didn't like all the names. As each of those spots that you rank your choice you're not as happy with that as, you're less happy with your 6th choice than you are with your first choice. Sure. So it seemed a good way to reflect that. And it worked out very well. That's how we ended up Canada's capital region, which was not my first choice. I haven't looked for a long time at the figures, so I can't tell you if anyone ranked it first. But it tells you we're in Canada. You can no longer mistake us for the Canada, the national capital region of the U.S.
Right.
Well, and what I love is your true dedication to the democratic process, right?
Thank you.
You didn't get the outcome that you wanted, but you appreciated the process as you went along.
The people spoke, I'm telling you. Exactly. And that's what we were looking for. But I also have to tell you that the complication with that process was the people, because they did not understand what we were doing. They didn't understand the ballot. They didn't understand they needed... I could tell, you said earlier, if you have 3 choices, you can just vote 1. But the people who just voted 1, it was clear they didn't understand we wanted to vote 6. It wasn't just because they only liked 1 and they didn't want to give any of the others a choice, an option, a chance. That's the word. So... And they gummed up the works in so many different ways. I had to sit there. I'm serious. I had to sit there with these 60 or 80 or 100 ballots. I don't even remember, and go, well, what do I do with this one? Yeah. So
it's not easy. So, and I'm sure that what also happened is what we often see with other kind of, everyone kind of has their best mousetrap, right? That they think will solve democracy. The unfortunate thing is there's really no one perfect, like this will solve everything. We like the instant runoff method, but one of the challenges that you ran into is, what is the difference between someone giving, certain points out versus others? So like, I think you could actually compare this to something like a pain scale, right? So everyone has a different interpretation of what a 10 on the pain scale is, right?
Oh, yes.
I see what you're saying. Right.
I remember in the hospital them saying, so is this a 10? And after I just had my baby, and I said, well, I suppose it could be worse. So I think that's often what happens with these other mechanisms as well. And that is particularly what you see in modeling. You assume that human beings will be rational actors. You assume they will all have the same assessment of how much they would rate something. So the reason why we like ranked choice voting is that it's very difficult. It's not impossible, but it's very difficult. And it's particularly difficult in real life scenarios to vote strategically, right? To try to mess the system. Because everyone can rank things in order of preference, no matter how much weight it has, right? So if I'm in the grocery store and they don't have carrots, I will settle for celery. It doesn't matter how much more or less I like celery than carrots. What matters is I know that my second choice is my second.
So in the real world, what are you seeing as the difficulties and the complications with this?
So I think the good news is most people get this pretty darn intuitively. There was actually, I don't know how scientific this was, but one of the organizations that I deeply admire, the Ranked Choice Voting Resource Center, did a study with kids in a school. They didn't do any kind of voter education at all. They just gave them a ranked ballot and said, rank these in order of preference. And the error rate was very low, right? So you don't have to go in with a huge amount of voter education, but it does merit some investment in it, right? You want to make sure that it goes well. And particularly anytime that you're introducing something new, you really need an implementation rate that's stellar to try to maintain public support for it. But I would say for a long time, our opposition was just the unknown. It was what is this new system? Will, particularly for those who are already in office, will this hurt me, right? Is always the first question that you get. And so I would say a lot of our work has been to quell those fears and to illustrate to those who are legislators that, in fact, this is often a better way for you to campaign and yield better outcomes in a way that supports you and supports the party at the same time.
But even the descriptions you've been using already, it almost sounds like what happens is everybody's fourth choice wins. And do we ever end up with
out of 4?
Right.
I mean, this is the way you're describing this. It really sounds like how often is there a first round and one person gets enough votes, or is it really the ultimate compromise and everybody just has to accept the fact you're never going to get the candidate you actually want?
Yeah, a come from behind winner is actually not that common. So, depending on how far you look back, it could be between 4% and 6% of elections involve a comeback winner. I would need to track back to see what our latest data is on that. But in 90% of elections, whoever the front runner is at the end of the first round will be the person who ends up winning.
Because I just try to think in any election, there's usually, you might have 10 candidates, but there always seems to be only 2 or 3 that are the viable candidates, for lack of a better word.
Yeah. And really what it does is it gives that leading candidate the mandate to lead, right? So what often happens is if you have some of these really competitive races that you've seen in the past, like I live right outside of DC, we have a DC city council races where you have 24 people running for 2 slots, and whoever wins, like, man, they've got a tough job at it, right? They're coming in. Yeah. They don't have a lot of support. They had a really fractioned constituency. They have a lot of people who are calling their office saying, I didn't vote for you and I wouldn't vote for you again, right? And they won anyway, right? And so it's really hard for them to go into office with that kind of confidence of like, oh, no, I actually have support. But for a lot of frontrunners, that would just reinforce the existing support that they have.
Mm-hmm.
I'm also thinking about it in terms of how you report it. So those people come in and the results were, they were the top choice of 2%, and they were the second choice of 10%, and they were the fourth choice of, whatever.
Right.
I mean, that does mean they start off with a burden, but those are results you have to report, I would imagine. You can't say, oh, just they won.
So if you're coming out of that first round with 2%, I'm pretty sure you're the first to get eliminated, right? Like, you still need a solid base. You really can't. I mean, I'm sure in some models you could set up a scenario where someone wins, but you really do need a strong base of support.
Okay, say 30%. But my point is that when the population is accustomed to this person is 100% a winner, instead you get a report that, well, they did pretty well in the first one, but they weren't most people's first choice, maybe, right? Maybe it's well less than 50%. So,
yeah, but it also indicates that there was some lack of consensus among that voting base, that maybe where you need to bring your voters together. Like now gosh, I should really be talking to this community more. Or man, I really need a solution on this policy issue that I got dinged on. And so you have that clarity too. And actually, like, I know we're talking about ranked choice voting when it comes to election methods. I love ranked choice voting polls for what it's worth. It's like,
that's interesting.
Fun, right? Because you actually get to see, like, okay, who do people like, right? Who do they like, but maybe not love? Maybe, let's say looking at a vice presidential candidates, FairVote found that, maybe Kamala Harris wasn't everyone's top choice inside the Democratic Party, but she was really strong, and she came in really strong with people's second choices too.
Interesting.
So when we look around the world, you said there was a bunch of states in the United States that's using it, but for our global audience,
yes.
Australia, you said, is using it?
Yes, Australia is using it.
And which version? And what are they using?
And is that nationally?
Yeah.
They are using it nationally. Now, they also have other mechanisms set up, including mandatory voting, right? So,
Right, they do, yes.
Democracy sausage.
Yeah.
But New Zealand also uses this form of ranked choice voting. Ireland does as well. It is truly popular overseas. And actually, a lot of folks who are listening to this might have used ranked choice voting before, because Democrats abroad used ranked choice voting to select delegates in 2020.
Yes, although that was in our delegate selection plan proposal for the coming election, and the DNC apparently did not allow any jurisdiction that didn't have ranked choice voting dictated by law, denied our using it. We have to use a different method.
I think you'll get to use it for selecting delegates. You like the actual human beings that are the delegates. I think the question is using.
Yeah, I don't think so, but I could be foggy on what.
You can also check. But it's certainly something that you've used in 2020. And then there are a bunch of Democrats abroad who live, whose home states are runoff states. Mm-hmm. So those are really strong examples of, Alabama, Arkansas, Louisiana, Georgia, South Carolina, Mississippi. These are all states where you have runoff elections, which means, if no one emerges with more than 50%, everyone goes back again.
Right.
And if you're abroad, gosh, you might not get your updated ballot in time. You might not be able to mail it back in time. And so actually, anyone who's listening who's from one of those states or votes for within one of those states, you get a ranked ballot just in case.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, that's right. But just from, anecdotal conversations here and there, I've heard, like California, I think, had one in the last election that came out well before. The ballot had to be out before a lot of the issues and candidates were settled. And it was apparently immensely confusing and complicated. Just a very, very long ballot where you had to do some research to figure out what went into different lines. So that is, I think, one of the complications people find. Depending on the situation, people can find the ballot very confusing.
Well, I was just thinking that for the last presidential election, my ballot had 20 choices for president. And to go down and the obvious ones, which was the Democrats and the Republicans, and then all the other fringe little parties and all the other individuals who were running. And that would take a long time to be able to figure out your top, to put them all in some sort of order.
Yeah, if you had to rank them rather than just choose one. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So have you seen, tell us more about the disadvantages.
I think one of the disadvantages that you're describing is like, do people care about second? Not everyone does, right? I think you do more when it comes to president because people tend to know who Pete Buttigieg was compared to Amy Klobuchar, compared to, Elizabeth Warren, right? So it was a little bit easier to rank choices in your mind. But if you're looking at kind of a down ballot race, it really does incentivize researching candidates, which, I'm not opposed to personally, right? Like my bias is that I think it is great for us to research the positions of people who are on that ballot. But we certainly don't recommend a system in which you have to, or even have the opportunity to rank 22 candidates. Limit it to something like 5, right? Because you're probably not going to have a 6th choice. Or if you do, it's going to be much less meaningful.
That is interesting because I could see you watching the debates with that in the back of your head of, I get a first, second, and third choice instead of just having one vote for one person.
True.
Yeah.
It would change how you participate for sure. But then you have to decide how you would limit the slate to 5, right? What if 7 people are all vying for those spots?
Oh, no, it's just giving people the opportunity to rank up to 5. So,
I see.
So that way it's saying, you still have 5 bites at this apple.
I see. But 7 candidates might be running.
Yeah, maybe 7 candidates are running and you have that, it doesn't make sense for you to include on your ballot. And so those kinds of limitations are also a way to make this a little bit more manageable.
Right.
But it is definitely a concern. If you were to introduce something like this and not have those limitations and have 22 people running, I could see that ballot being quite intimidating.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I have to tell you, like David, I get a huge ballot from Massachusetts. Just with the current voting system we have, not only the candidates, but also usually, I'd say an average of 5 referendum questions or ballot questions. And every single one of those, well, the top offices, the candidates are familiar. The bottom ones where you're voting for a city council member or they're even farther down the ballot, they're even smaller offices. And those questions, they take significant amounts of research. So I'm doing it anyway, but yeah, I don't know. I'm just trying to picture how my ballot would be all the more complicated. And I'm somebody, I in general, from what I've understand of ranked choice voting so far, I favor it. Like I said, I made one up on my own, but just imagining it's already pages long. It would probably be double the size and double the research to try to get that return.
So basically, what you might assume is that people get overwhelmed and don't rank candidates, right? So that would be a real concern. But what we have actually seen is that 71% of voters rank multiple candidates. And for really competitive races, like look at the New York City mayor election, it was closer to 90%, right? And so what that means is you have a better influence on the outcome. So in all ranked choice voting elections since 2004, when I would say this RCV renaissance really started taking hold, 73% of ballots ranked the winning candidate in their top 3, right? So you see something where people are invested in ranking, and then they're invested in the outcomes too.
Mm-hmm. Oh, interesting.
Right? It's a concern that I also had, but it's one where the numbers that are being borne out are really optimistic, and I think that's part of why FairVote took so long to say, like, okay,
to pick which ones
back, like which one should we focus on, and so it was not just like model testing it, but also kicking the tires on it when it came to seeing it in action.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Well, and I think you can also always argue there will be a flaw in every single voting system that anybody could ever invent.
That's true. Yes. And if you want, we can always talk about like, what does ranked choice voting look like if it's leveled up? So what's the next stage? Because I love ranked choice voting and I see it as closing a lot of the loopholes that really make voting frustrating or annoying and difficult. But there are also we talked about the proportional form of ranked choice voting. There is a bill for Congress called the Fair Representation Act. And when you talk about polarization and the incentives that drive our elections, this is an example of a piece of federal legislation that would really shift the priorities in Congress. And like, I don't know how many people love Congress right now, but I think the solutions that is actually truly meaningful and on the table. And so it would combine this multi-winner proportional form of ranked choice voting that we talked about earlier, and it would expand the size of districts and turn them into multi-winner districts. So you would have more than one member of Congress that you're voting for on election day, and the incentives completely change. Like, there's no such thing as gerrymandering at that point, right? You can't even find a computer that can game the system.
Right.
You members of Congress, you have one who will always listen to you. You have probably one who will never listen to you. And then you have someone who has to fight for your vote, right? So I live in Representative Raskin's district. Representative Raskin, much adored, wins consistently with majorities. If I call Congressman Raskin and say, listen to me on this thing, he could. he probably would. He seems like a nice guy.
Yeah.
If I called him and I said, I need you to care about this thing that he, really doesn't care about, he could easily just hang up, right? Whether or not I'm a supporter, because his margins are just so big that he's not fighting for my vote. But if we start to introduce legislation like something like the Fair Representation Act, I would have 5 members of Congress that I could call. I might have a Raskin who, might not need to worry about me as much, but I might have someone who's actually fighting on this. Or I might find that my members of Congress can work together in the same district, despite being across a political spectrum on something.
Interesting. But over a bigger geography. Yeah, sorry,
exactly,
go ahead.
Over a bigger geography. And that's how you get more Democrats represented in Arkansas, right? So how do you set up a system where Democrats in Arkansas and Republicans in Boston actually, have a reason to vote for a member of Congress?
Right.
That's interesting because I know here in Ottawa, there have occasionally been voted the idea of, currently we elect city councilors and each one represents a specific part of the city called a ward.
Yes.
And it has been floated on occasion that we should just elect a bunch of councilors who will represent the whole city. And I think it's a terrible idea because they're not answerable directly to the people who put them in office. So would it work on, you paint a very attractive picture, but would it really work that way?
So you have a larger geography, but the margins are lower, right? Your threshold is not 50%. It's something lower, which means that it's the stakes are higher. You might have a larger district, but your voting populace is going to have a much greater impact on whether or not you get elected. And it makes sense for you to work together with people, not just within your party, outside of your party. It'll still create space for either side of the political spectrum because of that lower threshold, right? So you can have your party purist, but you're also going to need people across the spectrum represented too.
Right.
Interesting.
I would suggest look into it. And now what makes it great is the ranked choice voting part, right? So just increasing to multi-member districts alone, it's okay, but it might not get you across the finish line in the same way.
Right.
But that's, when I get really excited, when I'm like, oh my goodness, the world could be a brighter, more beautiful place, it's almost always because I'm dreaming about that big, bold, beautiful reform.
Well, and in Ottawa, in Canada, we just use it to elect a new speaker for the House of Commons. But I do wonder, which version did they use?
Yes. I'd like to dig into that too.
What's really, you asked what the hardest part is.
Yeah.
I would say, speaking honestly, the hardest part is convincing people that it is possible to change elections, right? We are living in a society right now where it is just nearly impossible to do anything anywhere. And people's faith in government is at an all-time low. People's faith in the concept of democracy is at a low. And so, it's getting people to believe that the cure is possible is almost more important than making sure that the cure works, right? We could actually live in a world where this is possible. And it is, whether it's ranked choice voting or the Fair Representation Act, it's a piece of legislation that, either has proven successes or has real merit on the other end. And at least with ranked choice voting, our hope is that it cracks the door open to the idea that we can all make our democracy a bit stronger.
I think there's the question of whether there needs to be a change. You'll probably get universal agreement on that. Yeah. But then the question is, then what?
Then what? Yeah.
What if you replace it with something that doesn't work better, that in fact works worse? And then the chance of changing it again probably diminishes all the more. I don't know.
Well, that's why we invest in our research team as much as we do. I think that there are a lot of advocacy organizations out there that really just want to get the points on the board. And I'm from that space, right? I'm not an academic. I finished my bachelor's and was like, oh, this is great. Great.
Something fun to work on.
Right, yeah, right. But I think you're totally right that we need to prove that this works. And it means making sure that implementation is perfect. And we work with a lot of organizations that are on that implementation side. But it's also, we research truly every competitive election beyond a certain threshold. We researched ranked choice voting ones. We researched the non-ranked choice voting ones, the runoff ones. How much did those runoffs cost? How much money could you have saved? But also, when you do run those ranked choice voting elections, how did they go? What worked? What didn't? Were people happy? Were they not? So
right, and there do seem to have been. I gather that the 21 cities that voted it in have repealed it. So I know nothing beyond that fact.
Oh, no, we haven't seen a repeal in the last decade. So we saw 22 straight city ballot measures in a row. And I think a good example would be Burlington, where they repealed it a long time ago. And then it passed recently with a 2-to-1 margin.
Interesting. Okay.
So I think there is certainly a chance in our history, too soon could have been a question of some of those early repeals. But since then, I mean, I am not used to this kind of reform. I come from national security and civil liberties space. So I'm not used to the win rate that we have with this reform.
Right. Okay. All right.
Well, I certainly do see the logic in it. I understand why there are people who are advocating for it, because it does change the game.
It does. And I think there are a lot of people who are, in particular, are a little sick of being told to wait their turn when it comes to running for office. And they're sick of being told to hold their nose when it comes to voting. And I think all of us have been in that scenario where you're staring down the barrel of the general election and you see that independent party candidate come out and siphon off votes. And, maybe the problem is Ralph Nader. Maybe it's him. Right. But maybe it's also how easy it is for someone to hold an election hostage in that way. Right. So I think I personally was kind of sick of that panic that I would get and wanted to figure out why do we set it up so that I feel panicked every 4 years, So I think that there is a real opportunity there.
Well, interesting. Is there anything you want to tell us about it that you haven't had a chance to share?
Are you kidding? I could talk about ranked choice voting. You poor people. You don't realize how similar to Thanksgiving this was for me.
Oh.
Talk about Canadian Thanksgiving. I would have just been sitting there like, oh, well, have you considered surplus transfers? But I'm so appreciative of this space. And in particular, I'm so appreciative of the Democrats abroad who, honestly, when it comes to ranked choice ballots, have been doing this since long before it was cool, like way before I ever did. So I deeply appreciate your listeners.
Awesome. Well, thank you. And thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
I'm Rachel Oigster with David Schellenberg in Ottawa, Canada. Thank you for listening to Democrats Abroad, the Blue Vote Cafe.